Okay, there it goes. Alrighty, now we're ready. All right, welcome everybody to the third webinar in our Human Trafficking Awareness series. We are going to go ahead and get started here. So just a few housekeeping things to go over. If you're watching this through the webinar link, I've muted your mics to keep the background noise at a minimum since we're recording this. And for those watching on Facebook and on the webinar link, the chat is open. So feel free to ask any questions, and I'll do my best to keep up with that throughout the presentation and answer your questions, comments, discussion, anything like that. And as I mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, so it'll be available on our YouTube channel within the next few days, and I'll be sending out a link for that whenever I get that ready. And lastly, if you're on social media, which if you're watching this on Facebook, obviously you are, but I have a link here to all of our social media accounts, and I will put that in the chat section, and you can also scan the QR code on your screen, and that'll take you to all of our social media accounts. All right, before we dive into our topic today, we're going to just give a brief overview about Grace. Grace is a registered nonprofit with operations in Southeast Asia and in the United States. Our mission statement is fostering social change through strengthening families and eradicating the vulnerabilities of human trafficking and exploitation. We do this through our various programs, including our child sponsorship program, which if you have been following us for any length of time, you know that that is our flagship program. And more information can be found on our website or by reaching out to us via email or on social media about child sponsorship or any of the other programs and projects that we have going on. Okay, what is human trafficking? There are a lot of different definitions that will pop up depending on who you ask, because there are different ways to look at human trafficking. There are different perspectives. But the U.S. State Department defines human trafficking as the business of stealing freedom for profit. And it involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion in exchange for labor, services, or a commercial sex act. There are 3 types of human trafficking. And there are 3 types defined by the State Department: sex trafficking, domestic servitude, and labor trafficking. And today we are going to be talking specifically about labor trafficking. What is labor trafficking? You may have different ideas. You may have different images of what labor trafficking is. And when I was doing my research for this webinar, I Googled a lot of things. I looked up a lot of things, and there were several different definitions that I came across. And so we're going to go over just a few of them. And you'll see that all of them basically say the same thing. There's a very similar tone throughout each of these definitions. The first one is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Next, we have labor trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery in which individuals perform labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Are you sensing the theme so far? Labor trafficking includes situations of debt bondage, forced labor, and involuntary child labor. Labor traffickers use violence, threats, lies, and other forms of coercion to force people to work against their will in many industries. Common types of labor trafficking include people forced to work in homes as domestic servants, farm workers coerced through violence as they harvest crops, or factory workers held in inhumane conditions with little to no pay. One second. All right. Statistics. This is my favorite part of research, the numbers, just seeing the statistics. Not that they're good statistics. I hate that they exist, but they're interesting nonetheless. 71% of forced labor victims enter the United States legally. That means that 71% of the victims of labor trafficking are in the United States the proper way. They've gone through the proper channels. They filled out the proper documentation. They are here legally, and the majority of them are still trafficked. There is a pie chart that should have just popped up on your screen. And let me just point out, all of the statistics and all of the data in these numbers came directly from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And these are numbers based on their 2020 statistics. Of the number of labor trafficking victims that they came in contact with through the hotline, 19% of them came from a domestic work situation, 8% agriculture, 6% construction, 5% illicit activities, 6% traveling sales crew, and 56% was other. And the other includes restaurant or food service, hospitality, which could be hotels, spas, nail salons, things like that. The number of labor trafficking victims identified through the National Human Trafficking Hotline in 2020 was 3,583. Over 3,500 people came through the hotline as a labor trafficking victim. And just to put that number in a little perspective, that number is more than the entire population of the town that I live in, which when you put it into terms like that is pretty baffling. But of those over 3,500 people, 69% of them were recruited by a potential or current employer. 15% were recruited by a member of their own family. And 5% were recruited by an intimate partner or a marriage proposition. All right, we talk a lot about vulnerabilities. We work on the prevention side of human trafficking, meaning that we try to stop it before it ever starts. So we're really big into looking at the vulnerabilities and what causes a person to be more vulnerable than the next person when it comes to situations like this. So these are the top 5 vulnerabilities in regards to labor trafficking: recent migrations or relocation, self-reported economic hardship, unstable housing, meaning transient housing situations, homelessness, that sort of thing, criminal record or history, or substance use concerns. Who is affected? Victims can be any age, race, religious affiliation, gender, or nationality. Traffickers don't discriminate based on any of those things. They see an opportunity and they go for it. And victims can come from any socioeconomic background. And while certain situations do make a person more vulnerable than others, like poverty, low income, things like that, it is not a cut and dry situation where just because someone may have more money than the next person doesn't necessarily mean that they are still not at risk. There are a lot of factors to consider. Other risk factors. Unstable immigration status. We talked about that a little bit with the migration vulnerabilities earlier, just a minute ago. Language barriers. Obviously, if you're in a new environment and you don't speak the language, it will be very easy to take advantage of a situation like that. Poverty and lack of basic needs like food, shelter, and safety. Lack of social support system like family, friends, and community. Psychological effects of a recent or past trauma. And physical or developmental disabilities. And all of these things that we're talking about here, all these things that I'm pointing out to you guys, came directly from reports from the U.S. State Department, the Justice Department, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So these are factors that they research when people come through them or when they're working on case studies or anything like that. So this is why these items have made the list. Okay, this was a very interesting piece of information that I came across doing my research. And I'm just going to pause for a second and just take a look and see if I'm missing anything in the chat. And I'm not. Does anybody have any questions up until this point before we move further? All right, so Operation Blooming Onion. I had not heard of this before reading about it, and it's quite interesting. So in November of 2021, so less than a year ago, there were 24 defendants who were indicted on federal conspiracy charges as a result of a multi-organizational investigation. Charges include forced labor, conspiracy to engage in forced labor, mail fraud, money laundering, and there were several more. These are just the ones that I pulled out to throw into the presentation. And in fact, if you want to read the article for yourself, it's just a few pages long, 3 to 4 pages. You can Google human smuggling or forced labor on South Georgia farms, and it's going to come up. The article that I found actually came from the U.S. State, the United States Attorney's Office, but you can also just Google Operation Bloomin' Onion, and it'll come up. This was what was really interesting to me. So activities took place in Atkinson, Bacon, Coffee, Tattnall, Toombs, and Ware counties in Georgia. And so I don't know if you're very familiar with the geography of South Georgia, But I live in a little town called Millen, which is between Augusta and Savannah. And Tattnall County and Toombs County are both about an hour away from me. I'm not very familiar with the other counties. I am assuming that they are going to be in the general area, just maybe a little further. But this was a little too close to home for me. I mean, my son plays sports against teams in Tattnall and Toombs counties. So just for a little context, that's the area that we're looking at here. Living conditions included cramped and unsanitary quarters, fenced work camps with little to no food, limited plumbing, and limited safe water. And if you remember, I said this just happened less than a year ago, November 2021. Exploitation of the workers included being required to dig onions with bare hands. And you may be thinking, why onions? So the area that they are going to be in is very popular for like Vidalia onions. Vidalia is actually very near these areas. Paid 20 cents for each bucket harvested, and threatened with guns and violence to keep them, quote unquote, in line. Conspirators are accused of raping, kidnapping, and threatening or attempting to kill some of the workers or their families, and in many cases sold or traded the workers to other conspirators. And if I remember correctly, there were actually a couple of incidents where some of the victims actually died, and I don't recall if it was because of the living conditions or because of the threatenings, like if they actually were killed because they weren't doing what they were being told to do. I don't know that the report actually said, but I do remember reading in one of the reports that there were some deaths. So that was quite an interesting read. All right, moving on, and we're almost done. What is Grace doing to help? Our goal, as I talked about before, is to eliminate the vulnerabilities associated with human trafficking and exploitation. We do this through our child sponsorship program and other projects, and through educational human trafficking awareness content like this webinar series that we're doing. How can you get involved? Great question. I would love to tell you. Become a child sponsor. This is a really easy way to get involved. We have partial sponsorships. We have full sponsorships. You can do a group sponsorship. If you have a Sunday school class of 10 people and you each want to give $10 a month, that's $100 a month. That is a full sponsorship. It is that easy. You can become a Grace Ambassador. We have 2 ambassador programs right now. We have one in Simpsonville, South Carolina, with a group of adults from First Baptist Simpsonville. We also have a teen Grace Ambassador program here in Millen, Georgia at Millen Baptist, which is doing really great things, and they are very involved in community events and those sort of things. So if you are interested in having an ambassador team in your area, please reach out to me. It does not necessarily have to be associated through a church. It can be, a civic group. It can be a friend group. It can be a family. I mean, the world is our oyster. We can do basically whatever we want to with that. You have the option of becoming a friend of Grace. And that is basically, Friends of Grace are donors who give recurring contributions. You can become a corporate sponsor. This is a great thing for churches or businesses to get involved. And because we are a registered nonprofit, all of your contributions are tax deductible. And then also you can volunteer. We've got some ways for you to volunteer, whether it be through helping us out with booths when we go to local fairs and hand out literature, to stuffing envelopes for newsletters, to participating in mission trips, to just about anything you want to think of. If you have a talent for something, we can plug you in somewhere. And all of this information is available on our website. And that address is there on your screen. It's globalreliefassociation.com. Or you can email me directly it's Jenny@globalreliefassociation.com. Send us a message through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, wherever you want to find us. Shoot us a message, and we'll find a way for you to get involved. And that is the presentation. Any questions, comments, discussion? Remarks? All right.